The land was vast, untamed, and harsh in the way only the old American frontier could be. Rolling plains stretched into the horizon, broken only by rugged canyons and the faint blue line of distant mountains. The sun beat down in the day like a burning brand, and at night the stars spread wide, cold and endless, watching silently over those who dared to survive beneath them. It was a land that tested the will of men and women alike, a place where every heartbeat carried the echo of danger and the promise of freedom. In this wilderness, lives often crossed in ways neither side could expect, and stories were born that carried the weight of fate itself. She had grown up with the sound of the wind against the wooden boards of her family's small cabin, a frontier home standing lonely at the edge of the prairie. Her people had traveled west with hope burning in their eyes, believing the land would reward their work. Yet life here was never simple. Every day brought the risk of drought, sickness, or raids from those who saw the settlers as intruders. Her father had taught her to ride and to shoot, not as skills for sport, but as necessities for survival. Yet beneath her strength lived a heart that longed for something more than hardship, something more than the silence of the plains. She often gazed at the sky at night, wondering what destiny the stars carried for her. The Apache warrior came from another world altogether. To his people, the land was sacred, alive with spirits, rivers that whispered, and mountains that stood as guardians. He had grown up beneath the same stars she dreamed beneath, but with lessons carved into his body and soul through war, hunting, and ceremony. His people called him brave, not just for his skill in battle, but for the fire in his spirit. He carried the memory of his ancestors in every step, and the blood of his enemies on the edge of his blade. To him, the settlers were strangers who cut into the earth without respect, strangers who brought both threat and sorrow. Yet he was no stranger to sorrow himself. He had seen his people scattered, villages burned, lives taken in the name of expansion. He bore that weight with pride and anger both. Their worlds were never meant to touch. Yet fate on the frontier had its own way of binding lives together. It began on a summer evening when the sun dipped low and painted the horizon red. She had wandered farther than usual, tending the cattle near the river, humming a song her mother had once sung. The air was heavy with the smell of wild sage, the kind of smell that lingered on the skin and stayed in memory. She thought of nothing but the work before her, unaware that shadows moved quietly beyond the tall grass. Watching her every step, the Apache warrior had been scouting alone, moving silently as his people always had. He saw her before she ever knew he was there. To him, she was a sign of both danger and opportunity. A settler girl alone meant leverage, meant power, meant a way to strike fear where it mattered most. He did not stop to question it. His people had suffered too much, and he carried the duty of vengeance like a cloak upon his shoulders. Yet even as he watched her, something in her presence gave him pause. The way she moved was not careless but alive, and her song carried a softness that felt strange in his ears. Still, he hardened his heart and prepared to act. The sky darkened as the first stars appeared, glittering sharp and bright against the growing night. She bent near the water's edge, brushing her hand against the cool surface, when suddenly the silence broke. A figure rose from the shadows, tall and fierce, painted in the colors of war. His eyes burned with a wild fire, and his presence was so sudden it seemed as though the earth itself had pushed him forward. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear gripped her, yet something deeper stirred too. Something she could not name. He moved fast, quicker than she could react. Her cry was swallowed by the night wind as his strong hands took hold. The world spun in a blur of stars and fear. She struggled, every muscle in her body fighting against his grip. But his strength was like iron. Still, her spirit was not one to break easily. She met his gaze with a defiance that startled him, a look that carried both fury and a strange light of courage. For him, it was supposed to be simple. Take her, use her as a warning, and strike fear into the hearts of her people. Yet as the stars stretched above them, he found his resolve shaken. He had taken captives before, but none had looked at him with eyes like hers. Her fear was real, yes, but so was her fire. In that moment, something inside him shifted. It was not weakness, but something far more dangerous, something he could not name. The night deepened, and the prairie grew colder. The cattle scattered in the distance, forgotten. She no longer cried out, though her body trembled with anger and fear. He led her away from the river, every step carrying her farther from the world she had known. She wanted to hate him, to see him only as the savage her people had warned her of. Yet as the moonlight touched his face, she saw not only fierceness, but also sorrow carved into the lines of his expression. Neither spoke a word as the stars above bore silent witness. She wondered if she would ever see her family again, if this night would mark her end or the beginning of some darker fate. He wondered if the spirits had placed her before him not as prey, but as a test he did not yet understand. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant call of a coyote across the plains. The land around them seemed to close in, the grass whispering, the wind carrying voices from unseen places. She fought against the fear swelling in her chest, forcing herself to stay upright, to walk with dignity even in chains of circumstance. He stole glances at her, unsettled by the storm in her eyes, a storm that reminded him too much of his own heart. The night carried them farther, the stars bright as torches above, and though neither knew it yet, a bond was forming in the silence, fragile and raw. The fire of hatred had brought them together, but something else flickered beneath it, something neither could explain. Fate had thrown them into the same path, and the night was only just beginning, as the horizon swallowed the last trace of her world. She turned her face toward him, her voice steady despite the fear trembling in her chest. "If you mean to kill me," she said, her words quiet but sharp, "then do it now. But if not, tell me why you've taken me." Her question hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. He stopped walking, his grip tightening for an instant before loosening. The warrior's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw doubt there. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. The night waited, the stars gleamed, and the story of two souls from different worlds stood at the edge of a beginning that neither could escape. And there, beneath the endless sky, their fate teetered on the edge of something neither could yet name, something both more dangerous and more powerful than either had ever known. The answer was close, but not yet spoken. And the night held its breath. The night pressed close around them, thick with the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Every step they took seemed to echo louder in the silence of the prairie, the kind of silence that could make a person feel both small and watched. She walked with cautious defiance, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Who was he truly? Why had he brought her here? Every story she had ever heard about the Apache warriors spoke of cunning, strength, and unyielding pride. Yet as she glanced at him, she noticed something she could not quite name, a shadow of sorrow in his gaze, as though he carried invisible chains heavier than any physical restraint. He, too, wrestled with thoughts that were unwelcome. He had grown up among warriors who spoke of honor and vengeance, who taught that weakness had no place in a life shaped by survival. Yet when he had seen her by the river, alone and unafraid, something in him had stirred a curiosity he had never felt before. He did not understand it fully, nor did he have time to. The land around them was dangerous, wild, and unforgiving. Every rustle of grass, every distant crack of a branch reminded him that one misstep could be fatal. Still, he could not bring himself to treat her with the cruelty he had intended. There was a new weight in his chest, a strange pull that made him question the clarity of his purpose. The journey through the prairie stretched on, moonlight tracing shadows along the undulating ground. The girl's thoughts wandered to the family she had left behind, their small cabin tucked near the edge of the plains. The smell of cooking fires, the laughter of younger siblings. She wondered if her father would come searching for her, or if he would understand the danger she faced. A part of her wanted to run, to scream, to fight with every ounce of strength she possessed. But another part felt a strange pull toward him, a tension she could not name. His silence carried an intensity that was both frightening and compelling. She noticed the scars on his hands, faint but visible under the dim light. Each mark told a story she could not fully imagine: fights with rival tribes, struggles with the wilderness, burdens of responsibility that had been pressed onto him before he had even reached full manhood. His face, strong and weathered, held lines that spoke of hardship and battle, yet also of wisdom learned the hard way. He moved with purpose, but also with a careful watchfulness, as if the land itself spoke to him, and he listened with respect and fear. She began to understand that he was not merely a force of danger. He was a man shaped by a world she could barely comprehend. As the hours passed, he finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of experience. "The land does not forgive," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Neither do people. Those who do not understand that learn too late." She studied him, trying to read the meaning in his words. He was not explaining why he had brought her here, only reminding her that the world they lived in had its rules, often harsh and merciless. Yet in the way he said it, there was a subtle acknowledgement that he too had learned lessons the hard way. She remembered her mother's stories of the Apache, tales told in hushed tones over evening fires, stories of warriors with unmatched skill, and of a code that could be as unforgiving as it was noble. She wondered now if those stories had missed something essential if they had. Painted the warriors as monsters without ever trying to understand the hearts that beat beneath their war paint. She dared to look at him directly, and saw not just a warrior, but a human being with fears, regrets, and a strange kind of honor. The prairie seemed to stretch endlessly, a ribbon of earth and shadow that tested every sense. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing like a warning. She felt the tension coil in her stomach. Every sound was amplified at night, the snap of a twig, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of an unseen bird. She realized that she had been walking for hours without understanding how far they had gone. Her feet ached. But exhaustion was secondary to the unease that had settled deep in her chest. He noticed her glances, the small signs of tension that betrayed her inner storm. There was a time when he would have ignored such things, seeing them as irrelevant distractions. But something about her presence demanded awareness. Perhaps it was the defiance in her eyes, the strength she carried even in fear. Perhaps it was the quiet curiosity that seemed to ripple beneath the surface, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. He could not say. He only knew that the night carried them both further into uncertainty, and neither of them had the comfort of knowing what lay ahead. She remembered a story her father once told about the first settlers in the plains, about the delicate balance between survival and pride. He had spoken of the land as if it were a living teacher, shaping those who respected it and breaking those who did not. She now understood that the warrior before her had been shaped by the same harsh lessons, though in ways she could never have imagined. The thought made her chest tighten. She had entered a world she barely understood, guided by someone whose motives were still cloaked in shadow. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of smoke from a distant fire. Her heart quickened. Fires in the prairie could mean danger, either a natural blaze or a warning from other humans nearby. He noticed the shift as well, his body tensing as his eyes swept the horizon. Every instinct honed over years of hunting and conflict flared to life. He did not speak, but the urgency in his movements told her all she needed to know. They were not alone, and the night had not yet revealed all of its threats. She wanted to ask him why, to demand answers, yet the right words did not come. Fear made her careful, even reverent, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile boundary between them. He seemed aware of her restraint, watching with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It was a silence that spoke more than words ever could, a tension that threaded between them, binding them together even as it reminded them of the impossible circumstances that had brought them here. As they approached a narrow ravine, the moonlight catching on jagged rocks, he finally broke the silence again. "You must understand," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a hint of something she could not identify. "This land. It teaches those who survive. Sometimes the lessons are cruel, and sometimes they are necessary. You will see soon enough." She felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavier than the chill night air. They were a warning, but also a promise, one she could not yet interpret, one that hinted at challenges she could not yet imagine. The ravine narrowed into a path that wound upward, steep and treacherous. She followed him, careful to place each foot securely, aware that one misstep could send her tumbling. He moved ahead with the grace of someone who knew the land as an extension of himself, every motion precise and confident. She admired the skill, even as it unsettled her. The frontier was unforgiving, and he was as much a part of its rhythm as the wind and the stones beneath their feet. When they finally stopped on a plateau overlooking the vast prairie below, she could see the expanse of the land stretched under the night sky. The stars glimmered with a sharpness that made her feel small, and yet, in the quiet, she realized how alive the world around her was. The wind carried distant whispers, the sigh of the land itself, and the rustle of creatures moving unseen. She could not yet understand the full meaning of this place, or the journey that had brought her here. He looked at her then, a long, careful glance that weighed heavily with unspoken thought. "The night is long," he said, voice low and deliberate, "and the land is full of eyes. Remember that nothing is simple out here. Every choice has a consequence." She met his gaze, the tension between them tighter now, more charged than before. The night seemed to hold its breath, and she realized that this was only the beginning, only the first step into a world that was dangerous, unpredictable, and yet strangely compelling. Beneath the stars, they stood there in silence, both aware of the fragile balance between fear and curiosity, between the past and the unknown that lay ahead. The night was far from over, and the prairie still held secrets neither of them had yet uncovered. Somewhere beyond the horizon, challenges waited. Tests that would demand courage, intelligence, and perhaps a reckoning neither could yet foresee. And in that quiet tension, the girl understood that the story of her night had only just begun. The warrior understood it too, though he would not yet admit it aloud. The land had drawn them together, each step carrying them further into mystery. Each moment a thread in a story that neither could yet unravel. Beneath the endless sky, they were bound by circumstance, by danger, and by a quiet, unspoken curiosity that neither dared name. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, dark and full of secrets, and the night whispered that nothing would ever be simple again. The stars watched silently, and the story of two lives caught in the currents of fate waited for the next chapter to unfold. The night air grew, colder as the plateau stretched before them, the wind tugging at the edges of their clothing and carrying distant whispers from the valleys below. She hugged her arms close to her chest, trying to steady her trembling body. Fear had not left her. It had only transformed into a tight knot of anticipation, one that demanded every ounce of awareness she possessed. She was beginning to understand that surviving the prairie required more than courage. It required understanding the land and those who claimed it. He studied her quietly, aware of the tension radiating from her. In the long years of his life, he had learned to read the smallest gestures, the faintest shifts in posture, as clearly as words. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw determination, a fire that refused to be extinguished. That fire was rare among those he had encountered, settlers and outsiders alike. It was dangerous and compelling. He wondered if she would survive what lay ahead, whether her spirit would bend or break under the weight of the frontier. The conflict between their worlds was not merely personal. It was a reflection of the larger struggle that had defined the region for generations. Her people sought land, safety, and the promise of a future free from the hardships they had left behind. His people fought to protect what they had known since birth, the sacred grounds and traditions passed down through countless generations. Each step they took together reminded them both of the fragile thread between survival and destruction. The prairie was not merely scenery. It was a living participant in the story, shaping their decisions, testing their courage, and exposing the depth of their resolve. Hours passed as they moved cautiously through rocky outcroppings and narrow valleys. Shadows stretched long in the moonlight, and every sound seemed amplified, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of a hawk overhead, the low murmur of the river they had left behind. She found herself imagining her family, her home, and the simple routines that now seemed impossibly distant. At the same time, she began to notice details about him that had been hidden in the blur of fear. The careful way he scanned the terrain, the silent respect in his movements, and the moments when his eyes betrayed a memory of pain or loss. Each small observation deepened her understanding, though it also complicated the emotions she felt toward him. Meanwhile, the warrior's mind was restless. He thought of his tribe scattered across the plains in camps and villages. Some would see the capture of a settler as a triumph, a statement of dominance and power. Others would question his judgment, wondering why he had hesitated, why he had not acted with the decisive brutality that had defined his reputation. He knew that the path he was on could bring consequences far beyond the immediate moment, but he could not turn back. Something about her presence had unsettled him, shaken the certainty he had carried like armor. The plateau gave way to a narrow ridge, and they moved slowly, each step deliberate. The girl found herself studying the land with a new awareness. She realized how much depended on understanding the subtle signs, the shift in wind, the smell of smoke, the tracks in the dirt. Survival here required constant vigilance, a lesson she had learned in hours what others spent years discovering. At the same time, she sensed a tension growing between them, a silent negotiation of wills. Neither spoke of it, but each understood that their fates were now intertwined, at least for the night, and perhaps beyond. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she had been told about the frontier. Tales of settlers lost to the land of warriors, who appeared like shadows and vanished just as quickly. She realized that those stories, meant to frighten or inspire, had only touched the surface of the truth. The world she had entered was alive with complexity, and every choice carried weight. She wondered if she could ever return to her simple life, or if the events of this night had already changed her irrevocably. The warrior moved with careful intent, scanning the ridge ahead. His eyes caught the faint outline of movement in the distance, smoke curling from a small camp. Too orderly to be wildfires, too faint to be random travelers. His jaw tightened. The people in that camp could be hostile, a threat to either her safety or his own. The frontier did not forgive mistakes, and every decision carried risk. He motioned for her to stay low as they advanced, the night swallowing their figures against the uneven rock. She followed without hesitation, trusting him despite the tension that gripped her heart. As they drew closer, faint voices carried on the wind. The words were foreign, their cadence strange, and the warrior's eyes narrowed. These were not the voices of children or unarmed families. They were the voices of people who lived by rules that valued survival above mercy. The girl sensed the danger too, the electric pull of fear that sharpened her senses. Every instinct screamed that the night held perils that could not be ignored, and yet she found herself mesmerized by the quiet strength of the man guiding her through it. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the campfire's glow, silhouetted and alert. The warrior's hand tightened on the bow slung across his back, and he motioned for her to remain still. The figure did not see them yet, but every heartbeat carried the tension of impending discovery. She realized in that moment how delicate the balance between life and death could be on the frontier, and how easily a single misstep could unravel everything. While they waited, the girl's mind wandered to the other settlers in the region. Some would have already taken up arms in fear. Others would have hidden, praying that the night passed without incident. The complexity of the world she had stepped into was beginning to unfold, revealing layers of conflict she had never considered. There were battles here that were not always fought with guns or arrows, but with patience, courage, and the ability to read both the land and the people who inhabited it. The warrior's focus never wavered. He considered every angle, the possibility of ambush, the safety of the girl, and the consequences of making a wrong move. His people had survived for centuries by respecting the land and understanding the motives of others. He knew that every decision carried a chain reaction, and even a single lapse could mean disaster. The tension in his chest was mirrored by the girl beside him, though neither spoke of it. The night itself seemed to hold them in suspense. The stars above silent witnesses to a world poised on the edge of change, as they edged closer to the camp. The girl caught a glimpse of the small details, the patterns of smoke, the arrangement of supplies, the faint glint of metal in the firelight. Each observation told a story she had not been trained to read, yet her instincts guided her, shaped by fear and necessity. She realized that survival depended not only on courage, but also on perception, and that the line between life and danger was thinner than she had ever imagined. The warrior finally whispered, his voice a low hum against the wind. "We cannot linger. If they see us, they will act quickly. You must trust me," she nodded, though trust was complicated by the weight of fear and the uncertainty of the night. Still, she followed his lead, moving silently, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step carried the potential for discovery, confrontation, or worse. Yet beneath the tension, a strange awareness had begun to form, a recognition that the night had changed both of them in ways neither could fully understand. They skirted the edge of the camp, the firelight casting long shadows across the rocks. She realized that the frontier was a place of constant negotiation, a world where strength, cunning, and awareness were as vital as courage. And yet, she also felt the faint stirrings of something else, a fragile connection that defied explanation, a pull between herself and the warrior that neither could name, but that neither could ignore. The night pressed on, dark and full of uncertainty. She realized that the journey ahead would test everything she thought she knew about fear, trust, and survival. The warrior, too, understood that the challenges they faced were only beginning, that the frontier had more lessons to teach, and that every decision carried weight far beyond the immediate moment. Beneath the endless stars, both of them were caught in a world of tension, where every heartbeat mattered and every choice could shape the destiny of their lives. And as the firelight flickered in the distance, the girl and the warrior moved forward, bound together by circumstance, curiosity, and the unspoken awareness that the night was far from over. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, a living testament to the fragility of life, the persistence of conflict, and the strange, quiet possibility of understanding between two people from worlds that had always been in opposition. The tension remained unresolved, and the story waited, dark and full of promise. Beneath the watchful eyes of the stars, the first light of dawn had not yet broken when they moved through the narrow valley. Each step measured, each breath shallow against the cold air. The prairie around them seemed to hold its own tension, as if the earth itself sensed what was coming. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle of leaves, carried the weight of possibility, the chance of discovery, confrontation, or worse. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation that made her pulse quicken. He stayed close, his presence both protective and commanding. She noticed the way he listened to the wind, read the tracks in the soil, and scanned the horizon with a vigilance honed over years of survival. His people had taught him that the frontier was never passive. It was an opponent in its own right, testing every decision, every step. She had seen the signs, the way his hand occasionally brushed against his weapon, the way his eyes flicked toward every shadow. Danger was always near, and the frontier had no patience for hesitation. The distant camp from the night before had faded behind them. But the threat of other settlers, other warriors, still lingered. The girl understood that she had stepped into a world governed by codes she barely knew, where alliances were fragile and every choice carried consequences. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to the life she had left behind, and she wondered if she would ever see it again. The thought sharpened her fear, but it also strengthened her resolve. Survival here demanded more than hope. It demanded clarity, courage, and an awareness that every movement could tip the balance between life and death. He sensed her tension and spoke quietly, his voice low enough to blend with the whispering wind. "The land does not forgive those who hesitate. You must trust your instincts as much as your strength." She nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon as she followed his lead. She had begun to understand that trust was no longer optional. The warrior had become both guide and enigma, a man whose motives were partially hidden beneath layers of pride, fear, and something she could not yet name. The terrain grew more rugged, cliffs rising like silent sentinels on either side of the path. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and the rocks beneath their feet. She had never felt more alive or more exposed. Every sense was heightened, every sound and shadow magnified. The wind carried strange scents, the faint trace of smoke, the earthiness of wet soil, and a hint of the flora unique to this unforgiving land. It reminded her that the frontier was a world alive with secrets, and that one misstep could bring disaster. As they rounded a jagged outcropping, she glimpsed movement below, a small band of riders moving fast, their horses kicking up dust. He froze, pressing her down against the rocks, eyes narrowing in concentration. The riders were too far to recognize clearly, but the threat was undeniable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched beside him, every instinct screaming caution. The frontier had taught her lessons about fear and vigilance, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of this moment. "They are scouts," he whispered, voice tense but measured. "They move fast, but they are not aware of us yet. We must decide our path carefully." She felt the urgency in his words and the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. It was a delicate balance: stay hidden, escape, or confront. Each choice carried consequences that extended far beyond themselves, touching families, tribes, and the fragile peace that could exist on the edges of the frontier. The riders slowed as they approached a bend, and she saw them more clearly now, rough men, armed and wary, their eyes scanning the land for signs of movement. Panic threatened to rise within her, but he placed a firm hand on her shoulder, steadying both her body and her mind. "Do not move," he said. "Even the smallest sound will give us away." She obeyed, heart racing, muscles tensed for flight or fight. She had learned to trust him in ways she could not yet explain, and that trust was the only thing keeping her grounded as danger drew closer. The riders passed below them without noticing, their shadows fleeting over the rocky terrain. She exhaled a whisper of relief, barely escaping her lips. He did not relax, though, eyes still scanning, ears attuned to every whisper of the wind. The frontier demanded constant vigilance, and one misstep now could undo everything they had endured. She realized that their journey was a series of fragile moments, each one critical. Each one a thread in a web of tension that could unravel at any time. Hours passed as they moved cautiously, the sun beginning to paint the horizon with pale streaks of light. They reached a narrow gorge, the walls high and imposing, and he motioned for her to follow closely. "Here," he said. "We must move slowly. Every sound carries." She stepped carefully, feeling the uneven stone beneath her boots, and noticed the faint traces of other travelers who had passed before them. It was a reminder that the land had been a stage for countless conflicts, each story layered upon the last, and that their own journey was just one more thread in its long, complicated history. She thought of the subplots that had been woven into their night, the potential pursuit by settlers, the consequences for his people if they were discovered, and the invisible tension growing between them. Her mind spun with questions she dared not voice. Was he leading her to safety, or into greater danger? Was the pull she felt toward him merely the result of circumstance, or something deeper? The frontier offered no easy answers, and the unknown stretched before her like an endless horizon. The warrior finally stopped at the mouth of the gorge, crouched low, and gestured for her to stay silent. In the dim light, she could see movement below another group, armed and on alert, perhaps hunting, perhaps patrolling. The tension thickened, like a storm about to break. Every detail mattered. The direction of the wind, the angle of the sun, the smallest sound that could betray their presence. She held her breath, knowing that one wrong step could ignite a chain of events neither of them would be able to control. He leaned closer, voice barely more than a whisper. "We are close to the ridge above them. From there, we can see the path and choose our next move. But be ready. The moment we are seen, nothing will be easy." His words carried a weight that pressed upon her chest. She understood that the frontier was a test, not only of skill and courage, but of patience and understanding. Every decision now would ripple through the lives of countless people, and the line between safety and danger was razor-thin. She followed him with care, the tension between them palpable. Fear had sharpened her senses, but it had also drawn her attention to the subtle cues in him, the way he paused to listen, the slight flicker in his eyes when danger was near, the quiet determination that radiated from his every movement. She realized that the connection forming between them was shaped by shared vulnerability. by the unspoken understanding that both were bound to the land and to the choices it demanded as they neared the ridge. The sound of movement below grew louder, the clatter of hooves, the low murmur of voices, the distant glint of metal. She pressed herself closer to the rocks, heart hammering, every nerve alight with anticipation. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, yet she sensed the storm building within him as surely as she felt it within herself. The moment of confrontation was near, and the frontier seemed to lean closer, its vast silence amplified by the approaching tension. She thought again of the paths that had brought them here. The capture, the flight across the prairie, the silent navigation through dangers both visible and unseen. Each step had deepened the complexity of their story, revealing both the harsh reality of the land and the fragile bonds forming between them. She realized that survival was only part of the equation. Understanding, trust, and intuition were equally critical, and the frontier would test all of them to their limits. The ridge loomed above them, jagged and unforgiving. He gestured for her to follow, each movement deliberate. She could see the enemy below now, clearly enough to gauge their numbers and positions. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Every instinct told her to flee, to hide, to act, yet she stayed close to him, aware that their fates were bound together in ways neither could yet fully comprehend. He turned to her, voice low but urgent. "The moment we are seen, we must be ready. Nothing will go as planned. You must trust me completely." She nodded, gripping her belongings tightly, her mind racing with strategies she could scarcely imagine. The frontier had revealed its harshest truth. Control was an illusion, and survival depended on the ability to adapt, to read both the land and the people upon it, and there at the edge of the ridge, with the first hints of sunlight brushing the horizon and the enemy moving unknowingly below, the stage was set. The tension coiled around them like a living thing, and the moment of confrontation, of choices that could change everything, was at hand. Beneath the stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story, the night had given way to a day charged with uncertainty, danger, and the promise of revelation. The climax of their journey was close, and the prairie held its breath, waiting for the next heartbeat to decide their fate. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the prairie, brushing the hills and valleys with a soft golden light. The warrior crouched low on the ridge, his eyes fixed on the group of riders below. Every muscle in his body was coiled for action, every sense alert to the faintest movement. Beside him, she mirrored his stillness, her heart hammering, but her resolve growing with each passing moment. The tension of the night had reached its peak, and the land around them seemed to hold its breath as if waiting to see what would come next. He glanced at her briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the courage she had shown. Despite the fear and uncertainty, she had remained composed, alert, and ready to follow him through whatever came next. That alone earned his respect, though he did not speak it aloud. Respect on the frontier was measured not in words, but in recognition of skill, awareness, and strength of character. She had shown all three. The riders below had slowed, unaware of the pair perched above them. The warrior calculated their movements carefully, weighing risk and opportunity. Every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster, and he knew that hesitation could be fatal. Yet as he studied the group, he realized that not all of them were threats. Some were scouts, others likely travelers caught in the same tangled web of the frontier. It was a delicate situation, one that required both caution and understanding. He made a quiet gesture for her to follow as they descended from the ridge, choosing a path that would allow them to move unseen. The girl kept her eyes on him, trusting his judgment, even as her mind raced with questions. She thought of the families in the valley below, of the dangers that lurked in every shadow, and of the fragile balance that governed life in this harsh land. The frontier had taught her lessons of patience, observation, and adaptability, and now she relied on them more than ever as they crept through the brush. The sound of the riders faded behind them. The warrior led her to a small clearing, where the wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers and fresh water. It was a quiet spot, a rare sanctuary in a land often defined by conflict and survival. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the warmth of the sun on her face. and to take stock of the journey that had brought them here. Every step, every choice, had tested her courage, her instincts, and her understanding of the world. He settled beside her, keeping a vigilant eye on the surrounding terrain. For the first time, he allowed himself a measure of reflection. The night had been full of danger, uncertainty, and tension, yet it had also revealed truths he could not ignore. He had seen the strength in her spirit, the sharpness of her mind, and the courage that refused to yield even in the face of fear. These qualities had forced him to reconsider his own assumptions, to question the rigid code of action he had carried for so long. The girl finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Why did you help me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken complexities of the night. He looked at her, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her heart race. "Because the land teaches us," he said slowly, "that strength is not always in force. Sometimes it is in knowing when to act and when to hold back. You have shown me that strength can come in unexpected forms." She felt a strange warmth at his words, a recognition that their journey had not only been about survival, but also about understanding one another. The frontier had tested them both, and in that testing they had discovered qualities in each other that could not be ignored. It was a connection forged not in comfort, but in shared challenges. In the raw reality of the world around them, the hours passed as they rested, the sun climbing higher and warming the land. The riders from the valley below had moved on, unaware of the narrow escape that had passed them by. The girl allowed herself a small measure of relief, though she remained aware that the frontier offered no guarantees. Every day brought new challenges. Every choice carried consequences that could ripple far beyond their immediate lives. He stood and extended a hand to her, a silent invitation to continue the journey. She took it, feeling the reassurance of his presence and the strength of his guidance. Together, they moved across the prairie, navigating the land with careful attention to its signs and rhythms. Every rock, tree, and shadow held meaning, and their survival depended on understanding both the visible and the hidden forces at play. As they traveled, the girl reflected on the lessons of the night and the days that had followed. Fear had been a constant companion, but so had awareness, courage, and resilience. She had learned that the frontier was not merely a place, but a teacher harsh, unforgiving, and honest. It revealed character, tested limits, and demanded respect for both the land and those who lived upon it. The warrior moved with the confidence of one intimately familiar with the land, but he too had been changed. The girl's presence had challenged his assumptions, forced him to consider possibilities beyond his training and instincts. He had learned that the world was not as simple as force and survival. A connection and understanding could carry as much weight as skill and strategy. Beneath the harsh surface of the frontier, there was room for empathy, courage, and even trust. By midday, they reached the edge of a river that wound through the prairie like a silver ribbon. The sound of flowing water brought a rare sense of calm. They paused to drink, to rest, and to take stock of the path they had traversed. The girl looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, a growing understanding of the man who had guided her through the night. The warrior met her gaze, recognizing in her expression the same awareness he felt, the realization that survival had brought them to a place far more complex than either had expected. The river offered both sustenance and a sense of possibility. As they followed its course, the girl reflected on the journey they had undertaken. Each moment of fear, each calculated step, each silent observation had brought her closer to understanding the frontier and herself. She realized that the night's events had tested more than her courage. They had tested her perception, her patience, and her ability to trust. She had discovered strength in vulnerability, in clarity and uncertainty, lessons that would remain with her far beyond the edges of the prairie. The warrior observed her quietly, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor. Fear had not vanished, but it had transformed into something sharper, more resilient. She was learning the rhythm of the land, the patterns of danger, and the value of trust in someone who had once been an enigma. He understood that their journey together had created a bond neither could deny, forged not through ease, But through the trials and uncertainties that defined life on the frontier, as the day wore on, they encountered signs of the larger world beyond the prairie's small settlements. Other travelers and the remnants of past conflicts etched into the land. Each site reinforced the lessons of vigilance, patience, and adaptability. The girl realized that the frontier was a place of constant negotiation, a living classroom where every observation could mean the difference between safety and peril. She began to see the interconnectedness of all the lives shaped by the land, from the settlers to the warriors, from the travelers to the unseen creatures of the prairie. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows and bathing the landscape in warm, amber light. They made camp for the night, building a small fire that flickered against the twilight. The warrior sat nearby, tending the flames, while she prepared a modest meal from provisions they had carried. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a recognition of shared experience and mutual respect. The tension of the previous nights and days had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted into a space of cautious connection and reflection. She spoke softly, her words carrying both thought and reflection. "The land tests everyone," she said. "It tests us in ways we cannot always see, and it teaches lessons we may not understand until much later." He nodded, understanding the truth in her observation. The frontier was not merely a backdrop for survival. It was an active participant, shaping lives, revealing character, and demanding adaptability. They had both been tested. The lessons would endure long after the immediate dangers had passed. The night deepened, the stars once again stretching across the sky like silent witnesses. They shared stories of their pasts, of families, hardships, and the paths that had led them to this point. She spoke of her life in the settlement, the struggles of her people, and the hopes that had carried them westward. He shared fragments of his own history, the experiences that had shaped him as a warrior and a guardian of his people. In these exchanges, a bridge was built between worlds, a connection rooted in shared humanity and mutual recognition. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across their faces, and for a moment, the frontier seemed less hostile, less unyielding. Yet they knew the prairie remained a place of challenge, danger, and unpredictability. The night offered a temporary reprieve, a space for reflection and understanding. But the lessons of the land were never complete. Survival demanded constant awareness. The bond they had formed would be tested again. As they settled for the night, a quiet peace settled over the prairie. The girl felt the weight of the journey lift slightly, replaced by a sense of understanding and resilience. The warrior felt the same, aware that their shared experience had altered both of them in ways neither could have foreseen. The frontier had revealed its truths, and they had survived. They had learned to trust, to observe, and to adapt, and in doing so, had discovered strength not only in themselves but also in one another. The first light of dawn promised a new day, a continuation of the journey, and the unending rhythm of life on the frontier. The girl and the warrior understood that their story was part of something larger, the land, people, and the countless threads of survival and connection woven through the prairie. They had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, and emerged with clarity, courage, and a bond that would endure. Beneath the stars in the endless sky, they had learned that the frontier was more than a place. It was a test of character, a teacher of resilience, and a space where unexpected connections could be forged. The challenges had been immense, but the lessons endured. And as the prairie stretched into the distance, they moved forward together, carrying the understanding, trust, and strength that would guide them through whatever lay ahead. The night had passed, the climax of danger survived, and the story of their journey reached its natural conclusion, not with a triumph of force, but with the quiet recognition of courage, respect, and the fragile, enduring bond between two souls brought together by the land and the trials it demanded, top of form, bottom of form.